And I think they bought a bunch of them and spent a bunch of money on infrastructure in 22 and 23, but someone that's listening might correct me on that. But there's some very public failures of these large entities. Welcome back to another episode of the podcast for doctors by doctors. I'm Dr. Michael Jerkins. And once again, unfortunately, folks, you're stuck with just me for this episode. Dr. Ned Palmer is out today, but we'll be back on our next episode. But today we have a fantastic guest, another doctor entrepreneur who has taken their skills that they've learned in training and turned it into a large scale business that is not only treating patients, but providing opportunities for doctors to be in control of their practice and practice in a way that they want to on their terms and continue to grow that over time, which is, I think, talking to doctors across the country, a thing a lot of us want, which is how can we continue to treat patients, be clinical, use our skills, but at the same time, how can we also potentially build a business, whether that be related to our clinical work or not related to our clinical work. So our guest today is someone who's done it and built it up from scratch, has practices sprawling across 2 different states, and I think has a lot of insights that a lot of people will find interesting as they think about their journey on how to turn just their clinical skills also potentially into a business. So I won't waste your time further. Let's just go right to the interview. We are really excited today to welcome Dr. Vu Kong. Dr. Vu Kong is a general dentist and seasoned dental entrepreneur who has a passion for building a new kind of DSO, one that redefines the future of dentistry. As the founder and CEO of High Point Dentistry, Dr. Kong leads a group of 7 offices across Texas and Illinois, bringing a unique perspective at the intersection of healthcare, leadership, and business. Welcome to the show, Dr. Kong.
Thanks for having me.
Well, tell us a little bit about your journey into dentistry and then into what you've built today.
I guess I'll start from the beginning. So my father was actually a dentist, and his father was a dentist, but they were dentists in Cambodia, so totally different. They didn't have to go to school 4 years for dental school or anything like that, so it was a little bit different. But my dad's career was cut short because there was a civil war that happened in the 70s. So he only practiced for about 2 years, and the civil war broke out in Cambodia. So if you know the history of the Southeast Asia, there's a lot of civil war going on in that area. And so, we were fortunate enough that my parents escaped to Thailand, and that was where I was born. I was born in a refugee camp in Thailand. So when we came to the United States, I didn't even know that my dad was a dentist growing up. And, they were just, typical immigrants that worked hard, saved their money, started a business. In this case, they started up a restaurant, and that's where I grew up working as slave labor as a kid. So, but yeah, I didn't really have dentistry in my radar. I actually went to Michigan State for mechanical engineering, and decided that wasn't for me later on in my career at school. And I remember just talking to my dad, hey, I'm thinking about changing my career. And that's when he brought up, he's like, yeah, what about dentistry? I was like, oh yeah, I forgot you were a dentist. And so I always wanted to, obviously help people, and really I wanted to own my own business too as well. And so in medicine, that was kind of getting harder and harder. That window was closing. And so dentistry kind of was to me, it was like the last frontier for business ownership and the medical field. So that was kind of my journey.
You knew that you wanted to be a practice owner even before dental school, or did you go into dental school and decide that? Or tell us about your thought process. You grew up around small businesses and small business owners, given your background, but did you know that really going into dental school?
Yeah, that was on my radar from the get-go.
And so knowing that, I'm guessing you're in the minority of most dental students that I talk to, at least. They don't go into it already with entrepreneurial aspirations necessarily. And so someone like you who has some experience in small business wants to do it and is in dental school, were you satisfied by the amount of training you got on how to actually run a dental practice?
We had like one class on it, and it was very just a brief overview. So the training was very minimal in dental school. So a lot of it is just, learning on your own. But yeah, I mean, like I mentioned, like since my parents, I was fortunate that I had that mentorship from my parents who were small business owners. And so, but I saw a lot of things that they did, and I was like, man, I don't know if that's a lot of work. It was, even though they owned their business, at times it felt like the business kind of owned them, and so I kind of really kept that in mind.
Interesting. So you go to dental school, kind of your long-term plans. Maybe you don't have the best training, best training like most of us in medical, dental, or vet school. And walk us through after you graduate. So what are your next steps after you graduate dental school and going into practice? How did you take your first step as an entrepreneur?
At that time when I graduated, it was like 2008, and during the great financial crisis. And so I went to school at Detroit Mercy, and Michigan was hit pretty hard just because the auto industry was hit pretty hard during that time. So the opportunities in Michigan, weren't the best. And so I made the decision to move out of state to Illinois, Chicago. And, I just took the position that would offer me the best opportunity to learn as much as I can clinically. And so I moved out to Rockford, worked for a company out there. We saw a lot of Medicaid patients, and it was a high volume practice. But, I had only worked there for about 6 months, and I knew I was like, I got to get out of here. There was a lot of things that I felt maybe wasn't done at best. And so I wanted to, branch out and start my own business.
So how did you do that? I mean, walk us through that. We've had people listening today that are dental students or just out of dental school. You're saying you're 6 months out of dental school and practice, and you're like, hey, I need to do my own thing. So, like, how did you go about doing that?
Just a lot of, research and demographics research. Luckily, I had a friend, a colleague, a classmate of mine that went out to Rockford with me, and, we started brainstorming and, had a lot of coffee and whiteboard discussions about what we were going to do. And so I actually had a partner when I started up, and wouldn't have been able to do it without him. At that time, we're just so young, and so it was nice that we had each other kind of help each other out. But really, we didn't know anything that we were doing. We found a location and worked with the banks, and at that time the dental school debt was high, but it wasn't as high as it is now. And so we were fortunate enough that it wasn't too much of a burden for us. But we were fortunate that we got backed by some banks and were able to open our practice. But yeah, it's just a stroke of luck. We chose a good location and were able to build a good foundation.
Probably underselling your preparation there by a stroke of luck. It sounds like you were already really knee deep in the demographics research on where to open a practice and things too. And like, okay, so you go practice number one, right? And as we've already said in your intro, you've had several practices now that you run across multiple states. So I know a lot of people start practices. That's hard in and of itself. But adding a second location or adding a third location, walk us through how that journey was, when you knew you were ready, and how you go about doing that.
Yeah, I think that that's a great question, because I think it's kind of like a hot thing to do is just open multiple practices right now. And I definitely don't advise it unless you really have a goal in mind, because yeah, it really does bog you down personally and financially. And if money is the only reason to do it, then it's going to be a really hard journey. But that multiple practice journey for me, like I mentioned before, I saw what my parents kind of went through, and going back to that story, is that I felt like, their time was really tied up with the business, and really I felt like their business kind of took hold of their life. And so, I wanted to be able to build an organization that was able to sustain itself. And so, yeah, I mean, I think going that multiple practice route, I think for a individual, you really have to be able to, number one, have enough saved up and really be prepared to take a loss in your income, because when you do open a second practice, it does take a lot of your time and effort. And whether you're doing a startup or an acquisition, that's going to be a cash drain for some time. And so I think just really having your financial situation all set before you do that and make that jump is really important.
So how long was your first practice open before you added the second location?
At that time when I had a partner, we I think it was like year 3 when we actually opened our second practice. And going back to that story, we had a lot of failures on the way. And so when we opened that second practice, it took us some time for us to even break even. I think it was about 2 years for us to break even at that practice. But during that time, my partner decided to move back to his family in California, and so he sold his shares to me, and I just had my first baby, and running those 2 practices was just too much, and I made the decision to sell that practice. And looking back, that was a good decision. And so that was like year 3 or 4 after I graduated is when I sold that second practice. And really the next 6 years after that was just hunkering down. Maybe 4 or 5 years after I sold that practice is when just hunkered down. Spent a lot of time growing the existing business, the first office that I had, and getting our systems in place.
And then after that 4 or 5 years of hunkering down, so to speak, is that when you started to add these other locations?
Yeah, it was really, I think it was year 10 when I had that practice for about 10 years. It was a great practice, a lot of long-term patients, a lot of long-term staff. It was very profitable, but I always had that intention to continue to grow, but it wasn't really until 10 years into it, I remember one of my first employees had came up to me. I had just finished a root canal, and I was sitting on my computer just typing my notes, and I just hear this knock on my door. It's one of my first employees, and she sat down. She's like, "Hey, Dr. Kong, I'm thinking about quitting just because I just feel like there's no room to grow at this practice anymore." And for me, that kind of hit me hard. When you have an employee that worked with you for so long, when you have an employee that wants to grow more than you do, that's an issue. And that was really the catalyst for me to continue to grow, because we really wanted to offer opportunities for employees to grow within the organization. And so, that was really when we hit it hard. I think it was in 2019 when we started our growth phase. And so that's when we opened up 2 more offices.
So 2019, 2 more. Walk us through the others, if you don't mind. I know I'll keep asking you about this, but what was the timeline there? Because I know our audience will be curious.
So 2019, this is literally about 4 months before COVID. We opened 2 practices, and things were going great. The 2 of them were both startups, so 0 patients. First 4 months was great. COVID hit, obviously we had to shut down, and it wasn't like our existing office. When we had closed, when we opened back up, we were just slammed because of all the pent-up demand. The other 2 practices, it took a lot of time for us to rebuild those practices because we didn't have those consistent patients, the re-care, the cleanings for the patients to come back in. So, we basically had to start up again. And, things went really well. We were able to grow those practices. I wanted to continue to grow, and I felt like Chicago maybe wasn't the best area for us to do it at. It was already pretty saturated and wasn't much growth, and so we had this target in mind as far as where we wanted to be in 5 years, and that was really when I made the decision to move to Austin, Texas, and kind of plant our seeds here. So that was in 2021.
Yeah, I mean, we've had a lot of questions over the years of people that have one practice and they want to open up a second, or maybe they have a second practice and they want to open up a third. And clearly they've demonstrated the ability to run one well, generate cash flow, perform at a high level, but they really don't really know how to move on to location 2 or 3 or 4. And the biggest thing that we hear is simply that they can't find a bank partner that's willing to continue to lend to them on additional locations if they still have existing debt on maybe location 1 or 2. What would you say to those people, or what are some words of advice you would give them?
I think that, going from 1 to 2 location is pretty straightforward. You can manage that. 2 to 3, it's not, double the amount of work. It's like 10 times the amount of work. So unless you've maxed out your existing offices or existing 2 offices and they're running at full speed, you can't build any more spaces, you can't produce any more, you can't be any more profitable. I would focus on your existing practices first before you start to expand, because there's just so much more room for you to grow your income. In the end, that's really all that matters. So your take home, right? It's not your top line. It's really the bottom line, and all it really matters is the bottom line. So if you have a lot more opportunity to grow your bottom line at your existing office, that pays so much more dividend than trying to open up another practice that will do the opposite, where you're going to be feeding that office and it's going to take away from your take home. So that's really my advice in that aspect, if you're really thinking about going from 2 to 3 or 1 to 2.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. Well, walk us through the other question we get, especially from dental students on practice ownership, is balancing the clinical side with the management side and then actually having a life. So what words of wisdom do you have on balancing mental health and owning a business?
Man, I don't know if I have the right advice for that, but I was very intentional about our growth phase, and I knew that if I wanted to continue to grow, I had to take myself out of the chair, and I knew that I was going to take an income hit. I knew that it was going to be a process. So I think if you do want to continue to grow, when you do get to that point where you have 2, 3 locations and you can't be at every single one practicing, you really have to have a plan to take yourself out of the chair. Work-life balance, that's a difficult one, because I feel like that's even harder than managing 7 practices, is really having kids, dealing with the wife, and obviously your wife has to be on board too. And your wife and kids and your family has to be on board with what you're trying to do. And luckily for me, my wife is very supportive of everything that I do, and so I think even before doing that journey, you and your spouse, your family, has to be on the same page as far as what sacrifices that need to be made in the future.
Yep, makes a lot of sense. I agree with that wholeheartedly. It sounds like entrepreneurship is just something that runs naturally for you and your family. I'm curious, if you weren't a dentist, what do you think you would have ended up doing?
Probably something in finance. Start a bank or something.
Yeah, that sounds great. That sounds like a great idea. That will definitely not be stressful at all. Well, it's funny. I mean, I talk to a lot of doctors, I'm sure you do too, that are not all, but many are looking for other ways to generate income outside of just seeing one patient and seeing another patient. And it is true, you already mentioned this, that on the dental space, it's a lot easier to see than on the medical side of getting line of sight on actually being in control and owning your own practice. It's definitely possible in the medical. We do it all the time. We help folks all the time, but it's a lot harder in a lot of ways. And part of that, I think, is dental school is interesting because I've grown to learn this. How much industry is in the school? Like, there's DSOs coming in there. There's equipment companies. There's all these folks coming in and giving you free food and things. In medical school, at least in my experience, like, I didn't even know those people existed. They don't let them anywhere close to the school, which in some ways is good. In other ways, you're not really getting educated on anything other than the academic side and the clinical side. But is that helpful in dental school? Did you have people from DSOs coming and saying, hey, you should join us because owning your practice is too hard, you're never going to be able to do it, etc.? Or am I maybe hyperbolic there?
Yeah, when maybe this dates myself, but when I was in school, none of that stuff happened. But yeah, definitely, I've heard stories like you've heard where that's pretty common now. And I don't know how I feel about that. I know that it is getting a little bit harder now to be a business owner in the dental field. That is slowly getting more and more difficult because you have all this competition, because of the student debt. because of the consolidation that's happening in dentistry. But there still is a window. I'm sure medicine, we're a little bit lagging behind where you are all as far as the consolidation, but I think it's still a great opportunity for entrepreneurial dentists to start their own business.
Well, let's go back to the intro where we talked about the DSO you built and how you want it to be different than what's out there in the industry. So maybe even back up a little bit for our listeners who don't know what that acronym even means, DSO, and explain what that is and how your DSO is aiming to be different than what's out there.
So a DSO, I think the correct term is a group of dental offices that is backed by private equity or private money. I think that's probably the correct term for it, because I think multiple practice ownership, which is probably owned by a dentist, maybe more so of like a group practice. So, what we're trying to build is, a practice that's still, provider owned and operated, and where the doctors have a good culture and a good experience to work for. That's really my number one goal, is just to provide a good experience for our doctors and our providers to provide a good experience for our patients. And that's really it.
Sounds pretty simple.
Yep.
And what I like about that, the thesis is when the doctors are in control of the practice, then you can be, I think, more authentically focused on patient care in a way that maybe is harder if you're not doctor run and doctor led. Is that fair?
Yes, for sure.
Yes. So, I'm not to put a little plug in here because I'm not supposed to do this, I don't think, but that's like at Panacea, a whole big thing why we started, right? Was to empower doctors to have control over how they practice, and giving them the ability to own part of their practice, build wealth, but also practice on their terms. And that's what I love about what you've built too. And going back to your story about the employee that said, hey, I don't really have any room to grow here. You've created an organization that allows growth, but allows people to be able to practice in the way that they see best. And it's not just, I know there's spreadsheets involved, but it's not just numbers on a spreadsheet, and where you can kind of get very impersonal care at these large corporate practices. And thinking about that, I'm curious, why do you think that happened? What has happened in the last 10 years that has led to some of the consolidation in dentistry?
I think a lot of it is, it's a very recession-proof industry. It's a lot of consistency in the revenue and the profit that dental offices generate. It's a relatively safe industry. And I think in general, since historically most dentists own their own practice, a lot of them were just bad business owners. And so there was a lot of opportunities for private equity or big money to come in and really take advantage of that arbitrage, because of, when you have a industry that's very segmented, there's a lot of opportunities. And I really think that's why that the consolidation happened so much in the last few years.
And where do you see that going now? Is it going to ramp up more? Do you see opportunities or sprouts of growth where maybe the individual dentists that are coming out of school or residency are pushing back against that? I kind of hear both sides of it. It's cyclical, and some of the dentists have experienced working there and they would rather have a bigger say in what they do. But what do you see? What do you see the future of this?
I guess what I see and hope is two different things. I hope that it continues to be doctor owned and, entrepreneurial, dental provider startups and things like that. But I think more recently, the consolidation has slowed down because of the difficulties in financing by these large corporations, and the profit margin squeeze of a lot of the practices because of the inflationary costs. And so, definitely some slowdown in the consolidation, but I think when rates drop and we kind of get over this inflationary hump, I think it'll be the hot thing again.
It's interesting too, because I think you have a lot of large entities with lots of money, private equity, venture capital, whatever, large corporations, view it as a revenue generator and way to make money, understanding not as much about the complexity of how it actually works. And that is probably more complex than the medical side. But I mean, imagine all the large, like for instance, Walmart, bought all these clinics, spent a ton of money bringing clinics into the Walmarts, thinking they were going to generate money on cross sell and all this. But actually it turns out like primary care and urgent care is really complicated. Managed care is really complicated. And they're like, I don't think it's going to work. And just like, didn't even hold on much longer and said, hey, we're going to cut bait. And, but that's the thing I see is it's like, looks like it's an easy way to make money, but under the hood, healthcare is a lot more complex than selling light bulbs or plumbing or something like that. And maybe that's the same in dentistry. Would you say it's similar?
Oh yeah, very similar. That's interesting. I didn't know they did that with that. Well, I didn't know Walmart did that with medical side.
Yeah, it was a very publicized not success.
When was that?
I think they got out. They exited in 24, and I think they bought a bunch of them and spent a bunch of money on infrastructure in 22 and 23. But someone that's listening might correct me on that. But there's some very public failures of these large entities that thought they could get into medical specifically, and it's just too complicated for various reasons.
That's interesting because they did the same thing with dental, Walmart dental.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
I think it's probably around this, maybe a little bit before. Maybe they started with the dental side and then they're like, maybe medicine's.
Is that still very active? I thought there were some dental clinics in Walmart, but I didn't know how robust it was.
No, I think that they got rid of that too.
They also have enough money to just like, hey, we're going to try this and it doesn't work and we're fine. We're still I think the largest, employer in the United States. We'll be fine. But let me ask you this. You're someone who has a very, I think, interesting take on dentistry and tons of different experience, both clinical and on the business side. What's one thing you believe about dentistry or the business of dentistry that you think most dentists might disagree with? Do you hold any opinions that you feel are a little countercultural to the rest of your colleagues?
As far as the dentistry?
Yeah.
Well, I would say, going back to the multiple practice route, I think, if you're a single doctor owner, you can be more profitable than somebody that has, 2 or 3 offices. Mm. As far as the dentistry side, I don't know if I want to piss off anybody.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. We won't piss off anybody. But I think it's interesting, though. I mean, right? Like, that's counter enough to say, hey, like, you actually can make more money just making your one practice as optimized as possible instead of trying to create an empire. It works for some, but what I hear you saying is, hey, just hunker down on your one and make it as profitable as possible, and you might actually come out on top compared to having 2 or 3.
Yeah, I think that's a big misnomer. Is that I think a lot of people chase that multiple practice route because they feel like it is more lucrative, when in fact, just having one practice that you continue to expand and grow, you can do so much. You can make 7 figures doing that.
That's a hot take. I don't think you pissed anybody off with that take, so that's good. Well, okay, I'm going to ask a couple of questions. They're really not questions, actually. They're true and false statements. I'll say a statement, and you tell me if it's true or false. Okay, are you ready? All right. True or false? Dental school teaches you enough about running a business.
That's totally false.
Totally false. Okay, true or false? Owning multiple offices is actually easier than people think.
Can be true if you have everything structured.
I love that it can be true, but it's probably false.
Yeah, probably not. Probably not. Yeah.
True or false? In the next decade, DSOs will outnumber solo-owned practices.
I think that's false. I think there might be a tipping point, but I don't think it's going to be over 50% anytime soon.
Why is that?
I think there's not enough resources for young dentists to be successful with just single practices, and I think there's a lot of good providers out there still that are gonna keep dentistry strong.
Yeah. I also, just to add on to that, I do think there's a lot of people who have gone from dental school or residency into large corporate practice, and it's not what they thought it was going to be like. And so we have a lot of that kind of swinging against it a little bit. Maybe that's wishful thinking, but I've had a lot of those conversations with folks. Okay. True or false, leadership skills are more important than clinical skills in owning a practice?
100% true.
Tell me about that. Like you talked about how y'all screwed up a bunch in the first couple of years owning a practice. I mean, you've never done it before. Did you feel like you didn't have leadership skills at first, or you just didn't know how to lead, or walk me through how that played out, in your first couple of years?
I think the first couple of years as a clinician, you're more focused on your clinical skills and developing that, taking CE courses for all the clinical stuff, but we neglect the leadership side, and it took me a while for me to develop my leadership skills, whether that's going to seminars or learning by yourself. But yeah, I mean, I would say I've spent more money now developing my leadership skills than I have my clinical side.
Wow. Okay, so definitely true. Well, we always end our interviews with the same question, Dr. Kong. So I'll ask you what we've asked all of our previous guests, which is, tell us one thing that you've changed your mind about recently. It can be about dentistry or something else. There's never been more information available out there than right now. So it's interesting if we can take information and actually change our mind, or is it just reaffirm everything we already thought? So what's one thing you've changed your mind about recently?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I'm always change my mind because as the more data we get, we have to change our mind. So I think for me is that, the data means more than anything. What we see is, before it was all more emotional decision making, but now it's just all data driven. And so, I didn't really think that the data, for me in the beginning of my career, I didn't really look at the data. I didn't think it was meaningful, but now, our company is purely data driven.
So you're saying data in the corporate or commercial sense, right? So you think when you first were practicing, it was getting your clinical skills honed. It was kind of having a feel for what felt right to do, decision making. But it's now, I mean, you kind of have to, I guess, because you physically can't be in all your practices. You have to be data driven, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, before, I chose not to look at, as far as the profitability side, we kind of neglected all that stuff. I guess I felt like, as long as we did good for the patients and we produced well, then that was more meaningful than anything else. But now, it's the opposite. We for us to provide good care to our patients, we have to be profitable.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense. And I'm glad you're profitable. You are a success story, and I think one a lot of people look up to learn about dentistry and how to be an entrepreneur and a clinician. So thank you for joining us today, Dr. Vu Kong. This has been excellent. Where can people find more about you or your practice online?
Anybody, if any questions, can always email me. My email address is my full name, vukong@gmail.com. And that's probably the best way to get a hold of me.
Awesome. All right, Dr. Kong, thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you later.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us this episode, and you can catch the podcast for Doctors by Doctors on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and all the other major podcasting platforms. If you enjoyed this episode or learned anything here today, please take a moment to give us a rating and subscribe so that you don't miss a single episode release. To submit topic suggestions or guest suggestions or questions, you can reach us at podcast@panaceafinancial.com. As always, thanks for listening, and the next time you see a doctor, maybe you should prescribe them this podcast. See you next time.